Hi, this is Professor Wham again, and I'm doing a blog. Some of my extra shitty graphics here. I hope to do a couple more blogs during the holidays because I have time off, but this is one I've been wanting to do and trying to put together for a couple weeks. I recently realized that while I was doing my graduate work on UFO contact and abduction cases, that I had not read this book, the Tujunga Canyon Contacts. I did read it later in the 2000s after I was finished with my graduate work, but for some reason while doing it, I just never bothered, and now I realize I should have. I don't know why. It was just one of those books I missed. So what I've been doing in the past few weeks is going back and rereading classic works on the paranormal, particularly UFOs, since that's always been my area of special interest, but in some other areas as well. And I decided when I reread it this time that there were some things in it that I really liked, and things that felt like I needed to recommend this to people as an example. And then I did a little bit of research and found out that there was a podcast that was done by Our Strange Skies on this exact book back in the summer at some point. And so I listened to that podcast and realized that even though they do give a good summary of the cases, that in many ways I disagreed with some of their analysis. And I'm not saying this in a mean way. I'm saying this in that as a person who is older than both of the individuals who were talking in this podcast, I have a very different memory of the times in which the time in which this text covers and the context in which it was published. So I felt that there was actually much to recommend in these cases, despite the fact that some of the discussion in the book is dated by our current standards. Because for me, understanding the larger context of what Ann Druffel and Scott Rogo are trying to accomplish can make sense of why they approach these contact cases in the manner that they do. You don't have to like the interpretations, but given what they had to work with, there is a sense to what they're doing. So my review of this work will go in a few different directions, following my own interests and connections. And please understand, I'm not trying to diss the previous podcast at all. It's worth listening to. They do a very good job of summarizing the cases, for example, and in fact go into them in more detail. So I will include a link to that podcast in my description here and certainly in the written blog as well, so that you can listen to what I say and what they say and have a bit of comparison. So basically, what I plan to cover are some of the social and political realities that underlie the text and some of the things that the text reminded me of. So think of my approach as a sociological and anthropological primer, a means of understanding and unpacking content and context, particularly with older texts that may not reflect current cultural and scientific understanding. So this is my lovely picture of this particular text, and of course this is the latest edition that was republished by Anomalist. And here's a lovely present picture of the Tujunga Canyon area, which is different, far different now than it was at the time of publishing of the book, and also even more so when the supposed events occurred. It looks like a beautiful landscape as far as I can tell. But just to give you a sense of the type of topography that's being described here. And this, of course, is Ann Druffel and D. Scott Rogo. Ann Druffel died, I believe, this last summer. So she passed not too long ago. And this is not the most recent picture of her, but this is a picture that was printed in connection to one of the announcements of her death. On the right is Scott Rogo. He was murdered in the early 90s, I believe it was, and I think it was like 1990, 1991, in a case that is still open. There was an individual who was originally tried and convicted for his murder. The police apparently believe it was a botched robbery, but that person was released because of prosecutorial malfeasance or something like that. The prosecution mishandled some of the evidence. And so that individual who had been convicted was released. And so technically his murder is unsolved. And this is another picture of part of the area of the Tujunga Canyon. That's apparently how it is pronounced, or close to how it's pronounced. It's from an indigenous word. I say not the Ridge Road here because if you read the text, and especially if you listen to Our Strange Skies, one of the principal experiences occurred on something that was called the Ridge Road. There are now a number of ridge roads in the Tujunga Canyon areas, which is why I didn't pick any single one. So this is not necessarily the Ridge Road that is being referenced in the book, but it shows you the type of topography that you have here. This shows both a road and a trail. It's very rugged. It's a semi-arid desert. It's actually quite beautiful. So basically, the Tujunga Canyon contacts, the text describes the exploration, and this exploration occurred in the 1970s, of several apparent UFO contactee abductee experiences, which were said to have begun in 1953 and continued at various degrees of frequency among a loosely connected group of women who were members of what we would now be called the LGBTQA plus community. It's important to understand that that designation did not exist even at the time when this book was published. In fact, that designation is only as old as the internet, and it's really only about a decade old. The initial reported experiences involved Sarah and Jan, both pseudonyms, who shared an incident involving bright lights, strange entities, and missing time. And I'll give a few more details below. So the text was first published in 1980, and an updated edition was published in 1989. So Sarah is the driven member of this group, and what I mean by that is she's the one who first pursues investigating these experiences. And it is basically through her efforts to discover what happened to her that the rest of the overlapping cases unfold, although she didn't begin to uncover the extent of those 1953 memories until over 20 years later. Through careful hypnosis over time, Sarah recovers some of her memories, and researchers discovered that the entire complex of contact and abduction is much more complicated than they had originally anticipated. So Sarah, as I said, the principal and first reporting witness, recalled that she and Jan were awakened by incredibly bright lights outside their bedroom windows, followed by an invasion of strange entities that seemed to take control of her body and Jan's body, who was never able to remember anything very clear about the events, float them and her outside, clinically examine her, and then provide her with medical information about a cure for cancer. This sequence was remembered years later after Sarah was hypnotized in several sessions with qualified hypnotists. Initially, she just recalled some troubling images and a significant time lapse. Jan, however, remembered only the light, a few disconnected images, and the time lapse. Now, the completed study in the text uncovered that Jan, apparently, was the central node or nexus around which all the other contacts or abductions occurred. Other women who reported experiences were all connected in one way or another to Jan specifically, even though, despite concentrated effort, no amount of hypnosis ever helped Jan recover her own experiences to any significant degree. And, furthermore, these various individuals who were connected to Jan did not necessarily know each other, or not well. Readers may remember that Ann Druffel was the main investigator of the Harrison Bailey abduction account, a report that dates back a full decade, before the Hill abduction was said to have occurred. Now, the Tujunga Canyon cases, at least the initial reports, also occurred before the Hill abduction in 1953, as mentioned. Now, this does indicate that even in 1980, it was clear to Ann Druffel and Scott Rogo, and they both talk about this a little bit, that abduction experiences were occurring far earlier than previously thought. In fact, as I read the book, I realized that the initial Tujunga contacts occurred during the same period, the same time period, that Al Bender had his first encounters with the three men, and George Adamski had published his first contact ebook. So that's how early, just to give you a sort of frame of reference, how early these contacts occurred in this remote area. Now, when one remembers that the Harrison Bailey encounters first occurred in 1951, and you place them alongside these initial Tujunga Canyon contacts, it makes sense of how strange and tenuous these accounts seem to be. And that's exactly kind of what unfolds when you look at these early accounts. There was no mainstream narrative of contact or abduction yet, nothing and no one to which these individuals could compare their experiences. In fact, it wasn't until the late 1960s and early 70s that enough of a context began to exist that both Harrison and Sarah sought out assistance from researchers to attempt to understand what had happened to them so many years previous. So to me, what this does is it really kind of changes the timeline. You know, there's, and in Our Strange Skies, they talk about this too, how there's this kind of common narrative about contacts and abductions and all that sort of stuff that we still sort of maintain. You see it all the time in the media, and it's not like that at all. Things are far more complicated than that, and far more interesting. The Tujunga Canyon contacts was, as I mentioned, published prior to Communion and prior to Budd Hopkins' Missing Time. So the main comparative references used by Druffel are to the Hill encounter, to Betty Andreasson, Travis Walton, and the Pascagoula fishermen. Significantly, Druffel also includes elements of Bailey's account as well, which I thought was really interesting, and this is part of the reason I wish I'd read the book earlier, and speculates about how race was an important factor in the UFO community taking his story seriously. For Druffel, the early nature of the Tujunga contacts is one factor of interest. The other is that all of the abductees and contactees were members of the LGBTQ+A community, and she references them as gay, lesbian, or unconventional, as she would, because the acronym that we are familiar with didn't exist until the late 2000s at least. And these women knew each other through their associations within that community, which was undoubtedly much smaller and tight-knit in the 70s and 80s at the time of publishing. Now, the sexualities of the witnesses are of interest to both Druffel and Rogo, although for very different reasons. Druffel notes that reported UFO entities in abduction cases often seem to be interested in reproduction or sex, and that perhaps they were interested in examining non-reproductive lifestyles, although two of the women involved in these reports did in fact have children. So obviously, lesbians can reproduce. Rogo takes a more predictable stance, invoking Freud and rape fantasies when one of the principal witnesses, using the name Sarah in the text, as I've mentioned, confirms that she had issues surrounding the social limits placed on her because of her sexuality, and her identity appears to change over the course of her life, which Druffel does talk a little bit about, but doesn't really remark on that, other than just simply reporting it. After the initial abduction experience, Sarah left her lesbian lifestyle to attempt 2 heterosexual marriages, both of which, at least at the time of the writing, had failed. Now, that being said, Druffel's general approach is accepting and remarkably transparent for the time period. This is one of those areas where individuals who did not grow up before the 2003 Lawrence versus Texas case overturned sodomy laws in the U.S. have any real frame of reference for understanding how Druffel and Rogo are walking on eggshells in the reporting on the Tujunga contact cases. And I'll say that again. There were states that still prohibited gay and lesbian consensual sex until 2003. That's only 20 years ago. As a reminder, the last edition of the Tujunga Canyon Contacts was published in 1989. The first edition of the Tujunga Canyon came out right before AIDS, as the gay disease became a national concern and first focus of the newly empowered moral majority, religious right. It was still possible in 1980 and quite common for individuals who were gay or lesbian, and those were really the only two categories that were even recognized as existing, to get fired, denied housing, or otherwise stigmatized. In the state where I lived, if the authorities decided to prosecute a sodomy charge, it could result in a mandatory 15-year sentence in the state pen. Now, obviously, I can speak to this personally. I was fired from my first real job in 1983 for not being heterosexual. My boss correctly determined that I wouldn't be willing to sleep with him. And a group of friends and I were verbally and physically harassed and threatened with guns by a bunch of good old boys and their girlfriends during a barbecue and volleyball party at a local lake. They had taken exception to our group of young women who had no men with them and were not interested in partying. In addition, anyone who remembers what small-town lesbian communities were like, before the 2000s or even now in rural areas, can easily spot the dynamics of overlapping friend and romantic interests running just below the surface of the Tujunga Canyon accounts. Basically, if you're a gay or lesbian person of a certain age and you read this book, you're going to recognize certain things in it, certain types of dynamics that are impossible to describe to people who were not parts of those communities. And that's part of what makes the book interesting. Druffel's descriptions of their relationships echo the ethos of the time, allowing anonymity due to prohibitive social norms. So readers of the book must now needs remember that pseudonyms and hidden identities were absolutely essential for the subjects of this investigation. Jobs, careers, and probably larger family relationships were on the line. There's no way of knowing how out these women were to anyone in their social and professional communities. As someone who lived through these times, I found Druffel's approach to be particularly sensitive, not only to the needs of her research subjects, but to the possibility of prejudice on the part of her audience. Keep in mind that the UFO community at the time was even more profoundly attached to the extraterrestrial hypothesis than it is today, and was even more loaded with quote-unquote white men and their assumptions than still persists. In fact, an LGBTQA+ old-timer like myself found her, Druffel, to be remarkably open-minded and even-handed when approaching and describing her subjects. Now, some members of the UFO research community were also wrestling with the implications of a famous study that was done by Albert Lawson, which demonstrated that under hypnosis, subjects who were primed to remember a UFO or alien encounter could virtually create one out of whole cloth and seem to remember an experience they never had. Now, while Lawson didn't say that UFO contactee abductee experiencers were lying, he did imply that their memories could be created or based on other events, such as birth memory or traumatic incidences. Now, obviously, on the surface, such a study might seem to pull the rug out from anyone who used hypnosis as a tool to uncover such contact or abduction memories. Lawson's initial report was published in the late 70s, but he continued to develop this hypothesis until his death in 2010, and there are various subsequent studies that reference his work. Druffel is aware of the challenges that Lawson's study poses, and she references it several times in her commentary and interpretation. Thus, Druffel goes to great lengths to discuss the pitfalls of hypnosis and what precautions must be taken when using it. She points out the differences between the abduction stories told by the Lawson subjects and those of non-primed experiencers, and they are significant. The fact that these experiences were being reported by Druffel at all indicates to me just how important she thought they were, despite and perhaps because of the social and community prejudices that existed at the time. And this, by the way, these pictures are pictures that Sarah drew. It took her several hypnotic sessions to come up with these pictures. And if you go through the pictures, they're reproduced at the end of the book, you'll notice some similarities between what she draws and Betty Andreasson draws. Betty Andreasson is, of course, a superior artist, so her stuff is far more detailed. But you'll notice there are some similarities, and Druffel does notice that as well. For me, this is the real reason why Druffel goes to such great lengths to compare elements of these accounts with other well-known abduction reports that were known in the literature. And this is, of course, prior to abductions becoming the bread and butter of the media, namely the Hill, Travis Walton, Charles Hickson, and Betty Andreasson accounts. And this is where actually some of the most interesting material in the study becomes apparent, and the bona fides of the contact abduction experiences becomes really real. It's in the subtleties, the subtle comparisons that that Druffel is able to draw between what various of these women experience and some of the other abduction accounts. And of course, a key component in many of these accounts are those of a psychic or synchronistic nature, which is not something that Lawson's hypothesis can explain, nor is it something that the nuts and bolts school of ufology has ever wanted to deal with. Many of these synchronistic events followed the Tujunga percipients throughout their lives and influenced their jobs, educations, and their intimate relationships. Now, some readers might be even more discomforted by Rogo's interpretation than Druffel's because of his reliance on Freud and his clear to us now misunderstanding of lesbian bisexual identity and expression in women. It is significant that Sarah was clearly uncomfortable in some ways with her own sexuality, which she eventually was able to identify as being connected in some way with her mother's discomfort with sexuality generally. Now, that Sarah might experience dissatisfaction with the confines of a lesbian relationship in the early 1950s should not surprise us. That she and Jan might be terrified of a motorcycle gang invading their remote household should not surprise us, but rather give us a glimpse of the real personal and social risk lesbians were taking at the time and still take now in some parts of the world and in this country. That Sarah would attempt to go straight should not surprise us either. This is what was offered to gay, lesbian, or bisexual people as their only legitimate option less than a decade ago, and is still what many would like to impose, particularly for individuals who, quote-unquote, want to succeed in life. It's impossible to know what Sarah how she ended up identifying herself as. At the very least, she was bisexual, at the very least. She may have decided at a certain point that she preferred being a straight person. It's hard to know. So in light of this, Rogo's remarks, while jarring to modern sensibilities, are not in any way unusual, for his suppositions are probably precisely what Freud would have concluded about what Sarah's experiences and subsequent life choices were. In fact, as I read Rogo's commentary, I remember a comment that Budd Hopkins made at a conference, and I believe it was a MUFON Symposium some years later in the mid-1980s, a comment that is on record, yet he denied having made when he challenged it, that perhaps the alien abduction experience could explain the origins of homosexuality. It was a yikes then, and remains a yikes today. Now, what is more significant to me is that Sarah obviously remained in some contact with Jan at some level, or was aware of her location, since she was able to help Druffel find her after decades of non-contact. And remember, this is pre-internet. Sarah was also aware that somehow her cancer cure that she had been given was connected to Jan, even though the significance of that connection was never made clear. That indicates to me that Sarah retained some level of contact with the lesbian community of which she'd been a part, and this shouldn't surprise us either. As has been mentioned, the central figure in the Tujunga Canyon accounts is a woman whose pseudonym is Jan. Over the course of the book, Jan's fuller story gradually gets told. She was born into a difficult and abusive family, sexually molested at an early age, and left her family of origin in her teens. Now keep in mind this would have been in the late 1940s. By 1953, she's getting herself educated, has begun working on her own, and is living with her partner Sarah in an isolated part of Tujunga Canyon. Jan is a strong, independently minded woman and remains so to the end of her days. Now, after the contact abduction experience is detailed above, Sarah left the relationship with Jan and set out upon a medical career so that she could try to understand this cure for cancer she was allegedly given. She went through several years of training and ended up as a dental hygienist, which some might now consider a cop-out, but the truth is it was very difficult for women to become medical doctors in the 1950s and 1960s. A little compassion here, okay? Jan continued working on her own career and over time would become a skilled draftsman for an engineering and architectural firm, probably educating herself largely, because that's what women had to do during that time period. Also, over time, several of her future friends and partners, as they drifted in and out of Tujunga Canyon, Jan eventually moved from the area, but not returning permanently until right before her death in 1987, would themselves experience curious otherworldly contacts and possible abductions, all without knowing of Jan's initial experiences with Sarah. Now, of significance to Druffel was the fact that Sarah had received this supposed information about a cancer cure, the implications of which obsessed Sarah all of her life and, as mentioned, drove her to enter the medical field, while Jan had come down with cancer, first resulting in a complete mastectomy and then finally returning years later to cause her death. I believe she died in 1987. I think I said that. Sarah remembered that the strange entities had shown particular interest to Jan's breasts, which greatly upset Jan, who fought them off. Sarah recalled that Jan didn't like the fact that she was busty, endowed, so to speak, and so the inordinate attention shown to her breasts by the entities had particularly upset her. Jan was also able eventually to fight off the intruders until such time as they quit bothering her. She knew that she had had subsequent experiences, but just couldn't remember the details, and eventually she was able to stop the experiences entirely. The fact that Jan, and then another woman with whom Jan was associated, referred to as Emily Cronin, was able to fight off and end these experiences became part of what fascinated Druffel and led her to eventually writing a book detailing the mechanisms and techniques that some individuals have used to end these kinds of experiences. And while I don't have the graphic for this book up in these slides, I do have a picture of this book, How to Defend Yourself Against Alien Abduction, which when I first saw this published back, I don't know, in the 1990s or something, thought it was ridiculous. Didn't even bother to look at it. That was my mistake. There's actually some interesting material in this book, including some additional information about Harrison Bailey and about Jan, which, you know, stupid me. But anyway, this book actually has some interesting stuff in it, and it shows that Ann Druffel, despite the fact that she was a committed Catholic, was far more open-minded about different religious and psychological approaches than you would think from a committed Catholic, conservative Catholic, as she was. So if you read this book, it kind of places her interpretations in the Tujunga Canyon contacts into a very different context, because you can see in her interpretations in that book that she's getting ready to write this material. She's basically putting together some of the formulations for it. And I think that there is some basis for using some of the information in that book, in this book here, How to Defend Yourself Against Alien Abduction. I think there's some interesting stuff that needs to be reconsidered, and I will be doing that in a later podcast. So for me, the implication that these experiences are meaningful in some significant way, and that they are tied to metaphysical ideas and practices that several of the women in the book adhere to, is probably the most important aspect of these accounts. Taken as a whole, The accounts in this book reminded me of a woman that I knew many years ago who was a member of the LGBTQA plus community in Kansas City, Missouri, and who, in investigating her own strange paranormal experiences, found that she was also the focal point for these kinds of experiences with and in others. I helped her record her experiences, as she didn't require hypnosis. She remembered them. Like Jan, she had had a difficult childhood, replete with sexual and physical abuse, and had left home at an early age. But unlike Jan, at least as far as we know, she had been born into the Blackfoot Nation, but had been disenrolled when taken from her family in a government program for adoption by white parents. She always believed that her experiences were as a result of her ancestors trying to find her. So far from disproving the hypothesis that such contact abduction experiences occur in family or friend clusters, the Tujunga Canyon contacts merely expands what is meant by family, friends, and community, which is something I'm going to explore further in my next blog about the early Salisbury study of UFO sightings among Mormon populations in the Uinta Basin in Utah. For many LGBTQA plus members, again, before there was such an acronym, such communities took and can still take the place of family. Thus, it is not the hypothesis that such clusters occur principally in families that exploded, but rather we are asked to reevaluate what and who family might be. Druffel also draws attention to the fact that the area where most of the contact experiences occurred was known to the indigenous Tataviam and Tongva people as a favored ceremonial area. Prior to settlement and development, ceremonial sites were joined by walks and stoneworks, sometimes miles long. At one point, Druffel indicates most of the contact experiences occurred along one of these ceremonial lays, but it isn't known whether the subjects of her study were aware of this. What we see here is a map that can be found on the website of the Tataviam people, who I'm going to talk a little bit more about in just a minute. And if you look very closely at it, it says here that it mentions that there are labels tribal areas, and what they mean by tribal areas are places where ceremony was done. And one of these tribal areas right in the middle of the map is Tujunga. You'll see a little dot there. So this particular, the Tataviam people, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, they view the Tujunga Canyon area, which is a fairly complex area, as being a place of ancestral and ceremonial importance. And this is mentioned by Ann Druffel at one point, just sort of parenthetically inserted, all right? I would recommend to the Tujunga Canyon contacts as a fascinating account and study, not only in terms of the individuals profiled, but as an example of a text written about a contested topic featuring subjects whose very lives might have been used to discredit all such work, except that for Druffel, the fact of her subjects' unconventional lifestyles might also be seen as proof that something unusual happened to them. After all, they stood to potentially lose even more if their identities were to become known. Now, as a final note, I just have to address one of the criticisms leveled against Druffel and the Our Strange Skies podcast, and this is her characterization of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon hominins, her usage of those terms. They talk about this a little bit and criticize her. And I really need to say something about this, not only for professional reasons, but also for personal reasons. The full relationship of Neanderthal to modern humans was not known conclusively until it was possible to completely sequence Neanderthal DNA. This did not happen until 2010. So I don't care what you think you remember. We did not know exactly what their relationship with us was genetically until 2010. Now, prior to that, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, archaeologists and forensic anthropologists had started to reevaluate the physical evidence indicating that Neanderthal was far more sophisticated than previously believed. It is also worth noting that old ideas about Neanderthal were also based in part on racial stereotypes. There's actually been books that have been written about this. However, in 1980 and even into 1989, those old ideas about Neanderthal were still the standard narrative. The first book summarizing the new view of Neanderthal for the layperson wasn't published until 2011. I know because I purchased it. It was published by Oxford University Press, and it was called How to Think Like a Neanderthal. Summarized all of the latest genetic and forensic and archaeological and paleontological, all that information. My personal interest, however, in Neanderthal had been sparked by two reference points. One, a series of statements in the Seth material dictated in the 1970s that Neanderthal, indeed all early humans, were more advanced than science supposed at the time. And two, a profound visionary experience that I had in 1984, which provided interior information about Neanderthal that I then waited impatiently for science to demonstrate for decades. And maybe someday I'll talk about that. So far, only one of my interior revelations about Neanderthal has not been scientifically shown, but since it doesn't show up in physical evidence, it probably won't be. So I can assure the hosts of Our Strange Skies that the new view we have of Neanderthal was not recognized during the publishing history of the Tujunga Canyon contacts. One of the individuals says that they might have be 8 years old when the 1989 edition was published, but I was almost 30, and I was waiting, as I said, impatiently for my visionary intuitions to be borne out. I'm not right all the time, but when I am, I insist upon it. Now, all of this being said, do not let the outdated formulations of Druffel or Rogo dissuade you. The experiences of the principals, Sarah, Jan, Joe, Emily, and Lori, are interesting enough. The care with which the hypnotists work is a standard that should be applied to any David Jacobian-inspired amateur, and I know that some of you will get what I'm saying here. And between the lines, these accounts of contact, there are deep intimations of relationship, love, and community beyond natal family and personal agency revealed in these stories that should raise the level of all our paranormal conversations. And by the way, the indigenous Tataviam Tongva people of the Tujunga Canyon Angeles Forest region have survived all the attempts to assimilate and indoctrinate them, and are currently seeking both federal recognition and working to revive their language, which is a dialect of Shoshone. The official website of the nation I will include in the description and also in the vlog and the blog, so that you can check them out and what their current situation is. So they did not die, despite the attempts of both Catholics under the Mexicans and Americans to make them go away. They are still there and still recognize the Tujunga Canyon area as a sacred place of ceremony. That's all I'm going to say now.